Again, for those of you who just have joined us, this is a webinar on responding to environmental emergencies using composting as a management tool. This webinar was something that the NOAA's Disaster Debris Work Group wanted to hold to learn more about some recent how Maine DEP has responded to some recent events, and to also talk about some of the recovery efforts in the Virgin Islands that Mark has been involved with. Mark is originally from Winthrop, Maine, and he has been with the Maine DEP since 1991. So you're a veteran of the agency. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from the University of Maine and a Master's in Zoology from Southern Illinois University. Currently, Mark works as an environmental specialist in the Department's Sustainability Division, where he serves as the department's compost contact. In 1993, Mark joined the Maine Compost team, and in 1997 helped establish the internationally acclaimed Maine Compost School, where he serves as director and lead faculty. In 2014, Mark became a subject matter expert for the USDA and has served in that capacity at several avian influenza outbreaks across the country, and most recently in North Carolina, managing mortalities generated by Hurricane Florence. He provides ongoing technical assistance to new and existing compost facilities through the compost facility design, operations assistance, and compost process troubleshooting, and is currently working on a project to promote statewide composting of pre- and post-consumer food residuals as an alternative to costly landfill and incineration disposal. So it's great to have Mark joining us today. I'm going to turn over the presentation to him, make him the presenter.
Okay, so let's see here, show my screen. Okay, do you guys see the slides?
I can see them.
Okay, sounds good. Then let me just get this little guy shrunk down here. Okay, so what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about how we utilize composting to deal with large-scale mortality and other disasters that occur. And specifically, I want to start with talking about an unusual mortality event. Did that advance, Terry?
Mm-hmm. It's working.
Okay, good. All right, excellent. So this past summer, we had a major seal die-off along the Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts coastline. And it was a result of a Phocine Distemper, which is usually in their population, but because the global climate change is occurring and the waters are warming along our coast, it tends to be a bit more prevalent. And also in the late summer, the seals are molting, so they're somewhat immunocompromised. So the net result was a perfect storm to allow this disease to express itself as a massive die-off. And so starting around late July, we started having massive amounts of seals showing up on the coast. And currently in Maine, in order to deal with this response, we have the marine mammals of Maine, which go out to pretty much every mortality. They immediately got overwhelmed, so it became very crazy. I'm also going to talk a bit about Hurricane Florence and the response we did there, and some of the mortality management options that we developed down there, and then also a bit about the Virgin Islands and debris management. So, anyways, August through October, we saw a massive jump in seal mortalities in Maine. These seals range anywhere from a couple 100 pounds up to 500 pounds. So they become quite an issue. The other problem is that they were dying on beaches that were inhabited by tons and tons of tourists who also brought their dogs to play on the beach. So it became an immediate concern to us that the animals came in contact with the carcasses. Long before we even knew it was Phocine Distemper, we just didn't want the dogs rubbing against these animals, depending on what disease they might have. Around September, NOAA declared an unusual mortality event. And basically what that did is it allowed us to mobilize a ton of resources. The biggest resource that we mobilized was getting all of our state agencies together in one room and to talk about how to deal with this disaster, this crisis. But as you can see from the chart, we didn't really have an inkling anything was really happening until about the end of July, early August, when Marine Mammals of Maine contacted me and said, we're totally overwhelmed. I mean, we average about 60 seals a year, and we're already over 100. And I was like, okay, well, let's jump into the work and get it done. So we created in the department this interagency, multi-agency task force where we basically got together and we talked about common goals and common things we wanted to protect. It involved my department, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, because the state veterinarian is the absolute incident commander when it comes to animal disease outbreaks. So Michelle Walsh was very helpful. We also contacted Marine Resources, who used to house a marine mammal response group, but now they have a biologist there that's quite helpful. The Center for Disease Control, just specifically to help us deal with ways to prevent any potential spreading to humans or to animals. And then Marine Mammals of Maine, which is the group that does all the responses to seal strandings, whale strandings, whether they're dead or alive. And then finally, of course, NOAA. We couldn't do anything without their permission and their oversight. So on September 11th, we met with the CDC, and they developed us a fact sheet, which I'll show you. It was really well done. They are spot on when it comes to getting information out that's attractive, readable, and something that somebody would want to take time to take a look at. So we were very happy with that. And then my department issued basically a set of best management practices to help deal with these mortalities. And then what we did is we went on the road, and every community that had a problem with these seal mortalities, we sat down and said, look, this is your problem. We're here to help you set up a resource to help deal with this problem, but most specifically, you need to understand that you don't want your citizens getting in contact with these seals, and you want to protect especially any dogs or other animals that are on the beaches. So we need to all work together. But I can't myself, Mark King, go to every single one of these mortalities. It's just, there's not enough hours in the day. So I relied upon these teams coming together to help deal with this. This is an example of the fact sheet that the Maine CDC put together. As I said, they do a phenomenal job when it comes to getting out digestible, informative, and interesting information. And specifically, what we hope to do was get people to stay away from the animals. So if you look where the phone is, it talks about contacting the Marine Animal Reporting Hotline immediately and then staying away 300 feet, having that buffer away from the animal. Now, lots and lots of folks didn't get a chance to get this document in August, so I was getting called by people saying that their dogs were rolling on the carcasses, so we immediately would immobilize people as best we could to get those carcasses out of the area because we did not want those contacts to happen. But if you keep going through the document, you can see that they give information on the risks, and it just was really well done and targeted towards someone that's not going to spend a lot of time reading it. The next document is the BMPs, the best management practices, that we developed for our utilization. And specifically, these talk about how to properly handle carcasses. These were the guidelines that we were using, and the municipal groups that we put together were using to help deal with the animals. We were very concerned about burial and communication with groundwater because our water tables are so shallow in Maine. So burial was off the table. What we did allow was what we call above ground burial or shallow burial. And what that specifically means is that you dig a 12 to 24 inch trench in the ground. You then line that trench with sawdust or another suitable absorbent carbon-based material. And then you place the carcass on that bed, and then you cover the carcass with the dirt that you excavated to form the trench to begin with. it's a nice way of getting the animal contained without specifically putting them very deep into the water table. Some of the options that have been used in the past, which were considered but discarded fairly rapidly, there's been a ban on towing animals out to sea for many years, because when you tow them out to sea and attach jersey barriers or cement blocks to them and they sink to the bottom, once they start to decompose, the area they're attached by weakens, and then the carcass fills up with gas and bloats up to the surface. And in the case of whales, can actually become a navigational hazard, causing boats to capsize and things like that. So that's been frowned upon for quite a while. Removal and burial, that's also been frowned upon only because our water tables are so shallow. Bury on site in the beaches has been tried before, but oftentimes the carcass will start to internally decompose and fill up with gases, and has been known to rise up through the beach and then become a really big problem with maggots and other unattractive aspects. Incineration was never even considered because we don't really have facilities that can handle the material. The throughput is fairly significant that you would need to deal with all these mortalities. We did have a few times where Maine took some carcasses, but they were, sort of a last minute thing. And once again, to have it properly put into place, the storage issue with the rotting carcasses would be the biggest concern, odors and vectors and other aspects. Rendering, absolutely off the table, because they will not accept any animals that have any potential diseases. So we were left with basically composting and this shallow burial, above ground burial idea. And composting has always worked for us in the state of Maine. I've been doing this for close to 26 years now, and I was working with Marine Mammals of Maine when they're actually part of Marine Resources, and we have always been able to compost whales, dolphins, and other marine mammals. So we went with that as our main way to go. We also put the documents on our website, so if anybody is interested in seeing either of these fact sheets, you can go to the site I have in the box above, maine.gov, DEP Waste Residuals Index HTML. And if you look on the upper right-hand side, you have the brown button for the marine mammal fact sheet, and then the blue button for the marine animal disposal. So you're welcome to take those documents and do whatever you'd like with them. And if you want to spread the word, that's great too. So this just gives you a schematic of the two options. The option on the left is a typical compost pile. It is by far the preferred option for me. It's the one I'm most comfortable and familiar with. And it specifically involves just making sure you have plenty of carbon both under and over the animal. And the net result is that if the carbon is somewhat biologically active, like horse bedding would be out of a horse stall, you get a rapid degradation of the carcass with no odors. All the leachate is absorbed into the carbon amendment, and you end up with a compost product that can then be used on fields. There's a lot of things that can be done with it. The one on the right is the shallow burial system. And the way that this works, as I said, is you excavate a trench, line it with carbon, place the animal, which is that dark blob in the middle, on top of the bed, and then you repopulate the carcass with the soil that was taken out of the excavation. And then you also can put some fairly aggressive vegetation seed over the top, with the idea that as the roots penetrate into the soil, they'll actually start to absorb nutrients from the carcass as it breaks down. Both work really well. The disadvantage of the shallow burial is that it does result in land that's taken out of production, because it's very hard to work that soil after you've sort of entombed the animal in it. But there are a lot of folks that prefer that option because composting does require a bit more attention. So it all depends on what you'd like to do. But for the record, we did not have anybody do shallow burial in Maine. Everybody composted everything. So once again, just to explain biologically active, when you think about horse manure coming out of the stall, it has a lot of urine, has a lot of feces, and it has a lot of gut content from the horses. When those animals or the microorganisms get into the blend, there's a lot of available carbon, and carbon is their food source that helps them thrive. There's a lot of moisture from the urine, which is where they live, that's their home, and then there's a lot of nitrogen from both the feces and the urine that results in their ability to reproduce themselves. So what I normally see with a pile of horse manure coming out of the stall is roughly 140 to 160 degrees, indicating to me that it is full of microbes that are very happy, because the metabolism of the microbes is what generates the heat. So we want to use this material because it helps to retain heat, it absorbs moisture, and it does provide a great barrier that helps prevent odors from being released and does not attract scavengers or insects or other vectors that could pass on diseases to humans. So biologically active material is the way to go. Once we build our piles, it's really important, we've learned over time, to work them. Under the mortality management that we've done on the poultry farms, we're not allowed to turn those piles because they're worried about the disease. So what we have to do during the first 2 weeks of composting is just let them sit. And that time, we call that the first heating cycle. We have to get 3 consecutive days at 131 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, we then can turn it, and we have another 14-day cycle where we have to reach 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is what the standard is for avian influenza and other types of zoonotic diseases. In the case of working with larger animals, we don't have that ability unless we can size reduce the animals to be able to produce the compost in less than 28 days. So instead, what we were doing with these guys is we were putting them in a pile and letting them sit for about 6 weeks to be sure that most of the carcass had been reduced, and then we were allowing the turn to occur. And what I've found through the research that I've done at University of New England is that if I build a pile and let it sit for 2 weeks, and then turn it, let it sit for 2 weeks again, then turn it and let it sit for an additional 2 weeks, and do a final turn, I usually will reduce all the soft tissue and only the bones will remain. And that's a standard, but that also is for a non-diseased animal. For a diseased animal, they must be encapsulated longer because people are concerned that you might do a turn and release some of the virus that can then go on to infect other animals. So, but the whole idea of turning your compost pile is it mixes the material better, it redistributes air spaces, and it provides for enhanced biological activity, and that's kind of the key. So this is just a map to show what towns I was able to work with. I actually worked with Eric Hamlin from the Portland DEP office and Carla Hopkins from the Augusta office, and together we were able to meet with all these towns and get them all to adopt plans where they would take care of their own problem, and we would provide oversight to make sure there weren't any issues as they went along. And initially, the first couple of towns were a bit hesitant, but once it caught on, all I had to do was say, well, this town's doing it. Do you want to be, worse than them, or do you want to be better than them? And so it just became a matter of once you said, well, your neighboring town is doing this, they're like, well, we got to do it too then, because we want to make sure that we're just as good. So it worked out pretty well. So the way that a typical emergency response would work is that the police were called by a citizen saying that we have a dead seal on the beach. The citizen or the police would then contact Marine Mammals of Maine, and they would come and collect data, which is really important because they want to know what class of animal is getting impacted. Is it juveniles? Is it adults? Are they the really big ones? Are they really small ones? Is it one certain species? And then they would notify me to make sure that I was aware that it was happening so that I could go down and check and make sure that there weren't any problems with the process and could provide any assistance that they needed. Once that all happened, Public Works would dispatch a group down to pick up the carcass and remove it to a secure area, which could either be the transfer station, which we liked because of gated access, the area around the Public Works building, or a area that was decided by myself, Eric, and Carla as being a safe place to go. The compost pile would then be built, and the way that it was built is a bed of carbon was laid down. usually about 2 feet thick and roughly 12 to 15 feet wide. And the animal was placed on that bed, and then an additional 2 feet of carbon was put on top. Now, one of the things that I learned, which was really good for me as a subject matter expert, is that leaf and yard compost actually is a great material to use with carcasses. I was a bit skeptical, but some towns did not have access to horse manure or other biologically active material, but they did have leaf and yard compost piles. So we allowed them to go ahead and use that material, and it ended up working very, very good. But the main goal was, once the pile was built, it was to be left untouched for 6 weeks. This is the exciting thing. Yarmouth has a great operation. They always have, and so they got a little press on their compost pile that they were building for the mortalities. And the exciting thing to me is that a lot of these towns really enjoyed how good this worked, so they may actually keep this area available for roadkill as well, which is a very common problem for communities. So that was an exciting piece. I then went to Wells and checked out their compost pile, or actually I believe this is in South Berwick, sorry. And I checked their compost pile, had them dig in, and this was after about 8 weeks of composting. And if you look in the base there, you can see the jawbone and then a lot of pink material. That basically is all that's left of a 500-pound seal. And that's pretty amazing that it was done in leaf and yard compost. So that to me was really exciting. So I had them turn the pile, and as you can see, it's dark rich. And one of the really neat things about composting is, if you do it long enough in your life, you'll learn that every time you turn the pile, it gets darker and darker and darker as those humic and fulvic acids start to get developed in the organic matter. And that's a great indicator that the material is composting super well. So we got this good and turned, and that's the pile as it sits right now, and that's ready in the spring to be distributed to citizens to put wherever they like around their properties. So it ends up becoming a material that's value added. So moving forward, I'm now going to talk a little bit about mortalities that were brought to us by Hurricane Florence. For those of you that didn't follow the news, basically the problem with the hurricane is that it did not rapidly move through the area. It kind of hung out over North Carolina for 3 days and dumped about 34 inches of rain on a concentrated area. Now, most of the poultry farms are built on highlands, but they're surrounded by river systems, and this amount of water was just overwhelming, and it resulted in massive flooding of lots and lots of poultry farms. And the way that it worked is that the birds are sealed inside a barn, and specifically in North Carolina, they use a material called cool cell, which means that one end of the barn has massive, like, radiator systems where water is constantly percolated through it. The other end of the building has massive fans that draw air through the whole building. And as a result, it creates a constant environment in the whole building. Well, when these poultry houses flooded, the water just stayed inside, and the birds just had nowhere to go, so they ended up drowning. And it was very, very, very traumatic for the first few teams that dropped on the ground. I actually was one of the last SMEs to come in, and so I closed out the operation. And I didn't see a whole lot of the mortalities, but got more to do the troubleshooting of the piles and make sure that they met their time and temperature standards. But you can just see from this picture that the devastation was pretty dramatic. So the Hurricane Florence response, September 21st, we got the first call for assistance, and the subject matter started rolling out. And the recovery efforts extended into the middle of November, which is when I was there the last couple of weeks of November. And a couple of things that really were important for us is that we had always, as subject matter experts, gone to deal with mortalities from disease. We hadn't dealt with mortalities from flooding. And one of the biggest things that we do when we come to a farm site is we have to assess what the needs are. And the first assessment, the buildings were flooded to the roof. So tons and tons and tons and tons of carbon were brought in from all over the place, including Virginia and neighboring states. And these loads were coming at 100 yards per load for $2,500 a truckload. So it was an insane amount of carbon was ordered, and it was brought to the farm. It took maybe 3-4 days to get there. What happened was that when that carbon arrived, the waters had had a chance to recede. And so the carbon had been offloaded, and then the subject matter experts got on site and said, well, wait a minute, we only need half of this now. So the material then had to be reloaded and reallocated to different locations. So it was a very costly error. So we learned specifically that, we've got to think about how these waters are going to recede and what's going to happen so that we don't end up using too much carbon, because carbon is a very delicate and important material for us. And once it's gone, other types of carbon aren't as good. So we're talking, in this case, about sawdust shavings. They tended to be the best material. So a subject matter expert is required to do a farm assessment. So it's to look at the mortalities, look at the litter, which is the manure, look at any waste feed, and think about all the things that need to be composted. We then have to figure out how much carbon we need and what's available in 50 miles and 100 miles and 150 miles, and how much we can get. And then if need be, we have to go and look at that carbon to make sure that what they say they have is what we really need. Because sometimes they'll tell you they've got good carbon, but what you get is really terrible material. So then once all that material comes, we pull the birds out, the litter out, and then we build piles. So we oversee the windrow construction. And then while the piles are cooking, in the case of poultry, we do 2 cycles for 2 weeks at a time. And we have to meet 131 degrees Fahrenheit for each of those 2-week cycles for 3 consecutive days. So we monitor and make sure the piles are doing what they're supposed to be doing. We do journaling and record keeping. We have to write reports at the end of the day in order to let the government know what we're up to. And then when we're complete, we have to recommend the release of those materials to be utilized either as fertilizer or other activities so that the farm can repopulate with birds and get back to business. And so because of that, we carry quite a bit of liability insurance, because that recommended release is kind of an important thing. And so we want to make sure that we do everything correctly in order to make that release work. So it becomes kind of a real delicate balancing issue. As far as managing the carcass, you see a loader here. This is actually a 8-yard loader, and it's mixing birds and horse manure together. And then this is the process that we actually developed protocols for the USDA that they published on their website, and this is the accepted method. If you look at the top left, I'm laying out a bed of carbon. The birds are being dropped on the bed. In the case of Hurricane Florence, it was birds and litter. In the case of avian influenza, it's birds, litter, and waste feed, because that possibly could contain infected material as well. All mixed together, laid on the bed. We then spread them out a little bit, lower left-hand corner, and then you apply your cover, and then the lower right-hand corner, you end up with the windrow, and that basically sits for 2 weeks, and we take temperatures every day with the goal of getting 3 consecutive days at 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's really quite effective. As far as outside goes, that we've learned, we would much rather compost outside a building than within a building. We want to make sure the prevailing winds don't blow towards unaffected premises or towards sensitive receptors like a nursing home or a grade school or something like that. You want to always have your piles located at the top of the slope to discourage run-on from creating lots of leachate. You want to have a 2 to 4% slope to encourage water to flow off the site, but not to do so aggressively. And you always want to orient your windrows to be parallel with the water flow instead of perpendicular so that you don't trap water. We don't want to be located on a floodplain, because that's obviously not a good thing. And then the footprint of the site needs to be large enough to handle all the materials. And that's all done during the farm assessment. As far as soils go, we want moderately well-drained to well-drained soils with at least 24 inches to the seasonal high water table. That's very challenging here in Maine, so we often will bring in fill in order to try and create that separation. Similarly, we want 36 inches to bedrock because bedrock is a conduit to groundwater. And once again, the way to get that separation may be to bring in excessive fill. This is how I dealt with most of my birds when I was in Iowa in 2014, and it's very, very frustrating because the overhead constraints, you have to be careful of a limited ceiling space. The water, the red bowls up top in the left-hand picture are feeders, and also they have waterers next to them. And you had to be very careful not to hit those because that was a really big deal to the producers. So we tended to use a lot of small equipment like skid steers, and it would take a lot to make those piles work. And then to turn those piles was also quite a challenge due to the limited space inside. But from the standpoint of having no land available to compost on, this was the preferred option. I really enjoyed North Carolina because the majority of the operations that I worked on, we did piles outside. And as you can see, it's a much easier situation. There's a much more mobility. We were taking the material from the houses and we were putting it into a mixer truck and then dropping it on the ground in a pile and then building the windrows on a base with a skid steer or a small tractor. And the net result was you had piles that were very easy to manage and things worked really well. However, I will tell you that if you do not have proper expertise at a site, I arrived at a couple of locations where they had no subject matter expert and they did their own thing. And there's nothing more frustrating to a producer than when you tell them they got to rebuild their piles because they did them wrong. So I tried my best to help them not have to rebuild them fully, but we did a lot of innovative things to make these piles heat so that we wouldn't end up doing that. So that was a fairly exciting event for me. Now I'd like to just shift gears for a minute and talk a little bit about my work down in the Virgin Islands. And this was working with FEMA. I'm not listed as a separate matter expert for them, but I am working with them on several fronts. And this one actually happened to occur because of an affiliation I had as director of the Maine Compost School. One of my past students from about 12 years ago is now a commissioner of the Department of Agriculture for the Virgin Islands. And he called me up and basically asked me if I would attend a conference call. And what happened on that was I would listen to what they were talking about, and as things got more and more serious, we ended up developing plans to come up with ways to try and address the issues. But just to give you a little recap, between September 6th and the 20th, they were hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes back to back. And damage was done to all 3 islands. And the governor at the time tasked his cabinet, which consisted of Carlos Robles, who's the person that contacted me, Don Henry, Nelson Petty, and Roger Merritt, to come up with solutions for all this debris. And so we basically, I started on calls with them right at the end of September. October rolled around, and it seemed like we were just doing lots and lots of phone calls. And they had offered this air curtain incineration, and the debris team, which we became known as, basically needed to come up with a better option because there was a lot of opposition to it. And the legislature actually for the Virgin Islands declared that burning would not be allowed. So as I said, in October, we really started cracking on this, and we talked and talked and talked, and finally they issued an RFP, which I helped them develop, and they had one company that was able to come in at a reasonable rate, and that was Gore Fabric. But as you'll find down the road, Gore Fabric grossly underestimated what they wanted in the bid. They gave them a price, but for a very small facility compared to the facility they needed. So it was a misrepresentation. So basically, after they decided they were going to go with the Gore system, they asked me to tell them other ways they could deal with the material, because they weren't going to be able to put a gore system on all 3 islands. They were going to do that on St. Croix, and they asked me what could I do to help them on St. John, St. Thomas, and also on St. Croix as well. And so I started talking about different options, and one of the commissioners, I can't remember which one, said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you till Monday. Give us a list of what we can do. And so I hung up the phone, and I happened to be at the house. It was a Sunday evening. And I said, you know what? I'm going to call them right back. And I called them right back. And they said, oh, do you have a question? I said, no, I have your answer. I had been thinking about this for a while, and it dawned on me. And I gave them 15 solutions. And they thought about it for a minute, and then I was invited down the next day. And of course, I couldn't come that fast. So I worked out that I would be down the next weekend. And so between the 3rd and the 8th, I visited all 3 islands. I was hosted by very, very nice people. The other really cool thing is that they couldn't really afford to pay me anything. And, you know, I was compelled enough that I would have gone for nothing, but I mentioned it to my boss, Paula Clark, and she said, you ought to talk to the commissioner and see if he would support it. I think this would be a great extension of the stuff that you do. So contacted the commissioner, and the first thing he did was he laughed. But then after that, he said, yeah, okay, let me talk to the governor. And he talked to the governor's office, and it came back that they were willing to cover my salary while I was gone, and I would do it as a DEP employee. So once that was taken care of, the rest of my travel, food, and all that was covered by the U.S. Virgin Island government. So it worked really well, and I stayed with some host families and then in some different hotel rooms. And the thing to remember was that they were still, even in December, in heavy recovery. So a lot of the hotels didn't even have power. They ran on generators. So it was still an amazingly crippled area. So the first place I visited was St. John. And as you look at this picture, if you zoom your mind into the center where the beach is, you see all those boats. The boats basically washed up on the beaches, and they stayed there. Nobody moved anything. They just let stuff go. As a matter of fact, I was amazed. I went by one parking area that had close to 300 or 400 boats in a big tall pile, and I asked the guy from FEMA what was going to happen to those boats, because they were some really beautiful boats. And he said, well, if nobody comes to claim them, we're going to grind them all. And as a matter of fact, they ended up grinding most of that pile, and it was then taken off as debris. So that really blew my mind. There's just another shot of the boats up close, stranded. That's where they lay. This also kind of blew my mind. All because they got 36 inches of rain and over the course of about 8 hours, the massive losses of topsoil just everywhere you went. I mean, I immediately in my mind, I saw all this debris going back to replenishing organic matter that was lost. It was just an obvious no-brainer. The house on the far right actually had to be emergency stabilized because it was actually sliding down the bank and was going to be in the road. So major concerns there. Structural damage was insane. I mean, businesses basically had to be demolished. They couldn't rebuild them because there was so much damage. As you can see on the right-hand side, lots and lots of roofs were lost. As a matter of fact, as I toured the island, I saw a lot of blue roofs, and as I got closer, they were tarps that was just stamped with FEMA all over them. That was what became their roof. There's just a shot of the whole landscape. The one thing to notice, if you look at how green that is, but you see down in the middle center, there's a lot of dead trees. 2 months before I arrived, that was completely, all the vegetation had been stripped by the winds of the hurricane. It just was treetops with no leaves whatsoever. So it just shows you the ability of the land to recover from devastating events. This was another thing that blew me away. Tons and tons and tons of animals that were just free. When the people left and evacuated the island, they just let their animals go. And there were hogs and donkeys and goats and dogs and chickens and just you name it. And this is a landfill, and they're just munching away at whatever they can find because they're starving to death. But seeing animals on the side of the road was just, was a common occurrence. So then I went to St. Thomas. It was the island that was the quickest to be recovered. because it is the jewel of the Virgin Islands. It's where most of the tourists go. So they rapidly worked on improving the infrastructure around the island area. But debris was everywhere. I mean, you drive down the road and people would just bring all their stuff, and it was just going to be ground. And on the lower right-hand corner is actually a facility called Cancryn, which is where the demo debris was just collected en masse and just ground and ground and ground until it could be removed away. This was a very near and dear site to me. This is a landfill that got totally scoured by the hurricane. But if you look down at the lower sort of right-hand side, you see that swampy area, and those are very sacred mangroves that are really important to the island. So one of the immediate concerns I had was stabilizing that whole exposed area and then creating berms to protect those mangroves from any material running off and out of the landfill. So that became another possible use for this debris. And this is just another shot at the threatened mangroves. They're actually quite beautiful. First problem I had with the Army Corps of Engineer was that their first grind was 6 inches, and I asked them what they were grinding that for, and they said composting, and I said nope. You're going to have to go to 2 to 3 inch minus because we want to have enough size reduction. This is going to compost. So once I told them that, they immediately went and started grinding again and created a much better material that was suitable as a mulch and also suitable as a compost ingredient. This is the operation at Red Hook where they took just leaf and yard debris, and this was one where they ground down to a really reasonable size as well. Then I jumped on the seaplane and spent the rest of my time in St. Croix. And while I was at St. Croix, I went to the Body Slob landfill area where they had over 650,000 cubic yards. It was just amazing. It blew me away how much they had accumulated. And once again, we just wanted to grind. This is Anguilla Landfill, and if you'll notice in the center, the hurricane caused a lot of slope subsidence. So my solution there was using the ground material to stabilize the slopes. But then I also asked them what they were doing with daily cover, and they said, well, they were importing soil for a fairly heavy expense. So we talked about actually grinding the material and using that as a substitute for alternative daily cover. The initial concern was they have lots of fires in their landfill, and they didn't want to support that with organic material. So I came up with a flashpoint experiment where we actually did different blends of soil and the carbon amendment, and then we put heat on it, a torch on it, and found at what level would it not flash any further. And we got up to about 27% in the mix, and it would not combust. So that ended up being kind of our target for alternative daily cover for this landfill specifically. We also found this site, which is a caliche mine site where they mined limestone. It had a great access road and lots of good flat area. So we were going to build a facility here to do composting. Lots and lots of good concrete left over, so we had the infrastructure. The material you see in a hedgerow that's got trees growing around it is actual storm debris from a previous hurricane. So the resistance I met was, are you going to just create piles that we're going to end up just having more trees grow in? And so my response was, no, we're going to grind this material, we're going to utilize it. So we won't have these piles to worry about. This is the shipping where we could actually bring boats in to haul stuff off of St. Croix. So that was awesome. It was right in the same area as the Renaissance site, so that was an exciting piece. So anyways, getting down to kind of the plan for all the islands, grind the debris down to 1/2 inch, 2 inch minus, and create a mulch for general distribution. If the material was contaminated with plastics, which often happen when people put their garbage in with their debris, we would use that only on landfill areas, which already had lots of garbage and stuff around anyways, so the plastic wouldn't be a big issue. I was going to build a berm with contaminated mulch at the Bovani site between the edge of the road and the mangroves to prevent any leachate from coming out of the landfill. Compost the grindings to produce a value-added agricultural product that we could use all over the areas of really steep slope. Use a mix of compost or mulch and biosolids from the Anguilla biosolids facility to restabilize and revegetize the banks or revegetate the banks on the Anguilla Landfill. It was really important that we get some seed growth in there, so I thought the biosolids they had, if they were mixed into the mulch, would create a good nitrogen source to help stimulate root growth. We were going to also use the grindings for slope stabilization all over the place. And then a couple of other options I had was getting in the silt socks that are used as erosion control and actually fill those suckers up and just have them for future events. So if a hurricane's coming through, these could be deployed to help prevent erosional losses and protect shorelines. And then, of course, the alternative daily cover material to make sure that we were helping them save some money simultaneously and using up this material. The silt socks here just shows how they're made. The material is blown into a sock. And this is the biosolids they use, basically sand drying beds. So we were just going to scoop it and put it into a mix with the compost. And this just shows that on the right, you have a fairly unstable slope. And on the left, by you do terracing and other applications of organic matter, you can help stabilize that slope and let it vegetate. Alternative daily cover, that's kind of basically at the end of each day, once you have the garbage all in place in the cell, you then place a cover over it to help discourage vectors and other animals, and also to protect from odor releases. Some of the confounding factors was the governor was really, he was like, we're going to burn, 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 and if you can't make this figured out, that's what we're going to do. The problem with burning is that the climate there would allow all that smoke to hang very low, and there's lots and lots of folks on the islands that have asthma, so that would be a real huge issue. My other big challenge was getting people to utilize the the mulch material, because they ground termite nests, and people were concerned that the termites might come out of the mulch and get into their homes. So composting the mulch was one way of killing any potential larvae, which was attractive. But the other thought was for people that just wanted mulch. We had several companies that sell those coloration machines that they use for bach mulch. As they grind it, they spray a dye in that colors it. And I contracted with a couple of the companies to see if they would be able to do an organically based larvicide that could be injected into the grindings as they go through the machine. And there was quite a bit of interest in that, and that was definitely a potential option. Here's the problem. I'm a very type A person, and I felt like they spent money to get me there, so I wanted to give them every bang for their buck. And unfortunately, there's a thing called island time, which I learned very quickly about. And island time is not getting up at 5 a.m. and working till 6 p.m. It's a much shorter window. So I spent a lot of downtime reading and going to the beach and other things, as often my day didn't start till 9 a.m. and by 2:30 I was done, because that was just the extent of the amount of time that was to be spent. So that was a little frustrating to me, but I kept pushing and pushing and pushing for it. And I have a lot of great contacts at the islands, and things are moving forward, and we're ready, I think, for the next time it happens. But the big key is that you've got to have multiple solutions for this material, because when it builds up in a pile, 600,000 or 700,000 cubic yards, if you don't have ways for it to go away, people are going to try to just burn it, because that's the simplest way to do it. And that's pretty much all I have.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. We have a few minutes, and I've got some questions for you.
Okay.
So, we've got some questions from Michael Nork. Here we go. When towns used leaf yard waste compost as an alternative carbon amendment, was it finished compost or partially composted material?
It was partially composted material that had achieved 131 degrees. So it was already cooking.
Okay. And then there's a follow-up. Also, did they need to add any other bulking agents to the leaf yard compost to maintain adequate porosity and airflow?
The answer to that is no, and I was very skeptical on whether or not it would work, just because of the composition of most leaf and yard material. But I was blown away at the end result. It composted well, it stayed aerated, and they got good hot temperatures. So yeah, I'm a fan of leaf and yard now.
Great. So here's another one. In USVI, how did they manage debris while controlling contamination of non-organics / chemicals of concern, etc.? I can imagine in a disaster situation that stuff gets all mixed up, complicating cleanup efforts.
Yeah, what they did is they tried to get as much contamination out as possible. If it had any liquid residue like oil tank stuff, things like that, that went to the landfill. If it just had debris in it, that material went to the grind pile. If the debris could be picked out, it was. If it was too intertwined, that material was ground and it was put in a different category for utilization. That was the material that I only recommend to be used around landfill areas.
Okay. We've got some questions coming in from Kamiko Link. She's with EPA Region 2.
Okay.
When you say UPI are ready for next hurricane, what do you mean? Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, I just feel that the cabinet, basically they put together the debris management team, which had not been done before. The debris management team really understands what's going on. I gave them a report. I think Kamiko actually has a copy of my report. And I've told them that I'm a resource that's available whenever. But I think that they are in a better position, that they know based on how far this dragged out, that it's quicker. You got to get on this thing fast, and the resources that need to happen to make this material go into the appropriate location are available. They just need to be moved rather quickly. So I think what I mean by ready is I think that they have much more preparation and their eyes are wide open instead of being opened.
Okay, thanks. Another question is, did they apply the compost mix as alternative daily cover?
That was Roger Merritt is the person that I was working with, and my understanding was that was being started, but I have not received any real information on what happened. I know a tremendous amount of material did leave the islands. I think that was decided. I don't know whether, I know there's now another governor there, and maybe I'd like to talk with Kamiko offline about, I know Governor Mapp had one vision, and I think the new governor is more sustainable in his vision. So I'd like to know sort of what happened after there was a change of guard.
Okay, thanks. In terms of equipment, do you feel like there is enough equipment? And I assume that means like
on the island,
at the island. I assume.
Yeah. The answer is no. That's there's some infrastructural changes that need to occur. I was gung ho with the mulch, and then I went out to dinner one night and actually met a mulcher, and he told me that the biggest concern is the termites. The termites are a real huge concern because in the mulch they tend to proliferate, and then when that mulch is spread around someone's home, they go right after their house. So he said that was the biggest challenge, and I told him that composting would help deal with that. And he was very comforted by that thought, but he said, then we need to develop more compost facilities. And all those things were kind of recommendations that we made and discussions we had. So if anything, I would be open to doing more preventative maintenance before the next one with the USVI. And so I think I'm just ready to reach out and help them again whenever.
So I've unmuted Kamiko. I don't know, Kamiko, if you can, you know, since you have so many questions, I thought maybe you should just ask them yourself. Kamiko,
Terry, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes. We just have a few minutes left.
Yeah, no, I know. I see that there's like 1 minute. I just I mean, I can just read my other questions. But the rest of the material, there's quite a bit of material that was actually shipped off island.
Right.
Unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, but in terms of the larvicide, what larvicide were you recommending?
Well, there's a bunch of them out there that are biologically based, so they're not like a persistent chemical like a herbicide or pesticide that would be in the material if people were handling it, but they would kill the larvae. And I talked to the company. The company's name is BASF. They do colorization of bark mulch, And I saw them at the Compost Council conference in Phoenix just recently, and they said that they have actually done applications where they've added this type of larvicide to help kill pests in mulch before. So they definitely could do it. And I had talked to Carlos Robles about it, but I'm assuming that after I left, there probably was a lot of hurry up and wait. As I mentioned, the island time thing is, something they joked about, but I think that there are some realities to planning versus implementation in the Virgin Islands. I think there definitely is a lot of things that have to be accomplished before a plan can be put through.
Could you share with us those larvicides? I'm curious, and also the temperature of the compost. Would that kill the larva from the termites?
Yes. So composting, the temperature of 131 degrees would definitely kill the larvae. So that would be the preferred way to go. And you don't have to have. I mean, Roger was real interested in the Gore system because that was a system that was used in a facility in Maryland he managed before he went to the Virgin Islands. But you don't need to be that complicated. A big bucket loader and an attentive person would be awesome. I mean, Don Henry had invited me to stay down. Harith Wickema wanted me to stay and manage a pile that they would use a front end loader on. And I told him, I said, having me stay is wasting your money. I can talk to you from my home, and it's not rocket science to get the right recipe together and mix this stuff and cause it to compost. So it's a lack of education down there and just a real scared about what this entails, and it's really not that difficult. The plan that I laid out for them, if they implemented it, it would be great.
So I think we've just about run out of time, Mark.
Okay.
Again, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was great. I want to reiterate that it is up on our website already, the PowerPoint slides that you just presented. We will be posting the recording at some point in the near future, and I can send out an email to let people know that when the recording is available online. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mark. And this was great.
Sounds
thank you,
good.
Terry.
And if Kamiko's still there, Kamiko, my number is 207-592-0455.
Sure. Yeah, we'll catch up maybe next week then.
All right, that sounds great. And